All right, folks, we have a breaking news update in the ongoing search for 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie. That's the mother of NBC's Savannah Guthrie.
Well, since the beginning, this show has been calling out the incompetence and failed leadership of Pima County Sheriff Christopher Nanos in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. And now it seems that the locals have had enough too.
Day 47. And I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what I am about to show you is not a single mistake. It is not a moment of bad judgment. It is a pattern, a documented pattern buried across years of public records, internal reports, sworn testimony, and official documents that were always there, always accessible, and yet somehow never fully seen. And while that pattern remained unnoticed, Nancy Guthrie disappeared. A formal recall effort has now been filed against Sheriff Chris Nanos, confirmed March 12th by the Pima County Elections Department. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand not only why that recall exists, but why it took this long to happen and why the people closest to this department hesitated to act. Let me show you everything. The night Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Catalina Foothills home, January 31st, the investigation immediately became a national story and Chris Nanos became its central figure. He appeared across major networks, speaking with confidence, offering updates, shaping the narrative in real time. And yet, 47 days later, there is still no arrest, no publicly identified suspect, and no confirmed proof that Nancy is alive. Former FBI Special Agent Nicole Parker publicly raised concerns that many investigators were already discussing behind closed doors. She described a pattern where statements were issued, then walked back, then contradicted entirely. One message to the public, then another. Certainty followed by doubt. One sheriff, one camera, two completely different stories. But what you have seen on television is only part of it. What was happening behind the scenes tells a very different story. And this is where everything begins to change. On day 13 of the search, when every hour still carried weight, when decisions still had the power to change the outcome, something happened that should have immediately shifted the entire direction of this investigation. A federal law enforcement official did not go to just one outlet. They went to three at the same time: Reuters, Fox News Digital, and NewsNation, simultaneously. And what they revealed was not speculation. It was not anonymous rumor. It was a direct statement from someone with knowledge of the case, someone willing to go on record, someone who understood exactly how serious this was. Sheriff Chris Nanos was preventing the FBI from accessing critical physical evidence connected to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Not delaying, not reconsidering, blocking. The FBI had formally requested specific items. A glove recovered near Nancy's home. DNA samples collected from the scene. Standard procedure in a case of this magnitude. Send it to Quantico. Send it to the FBI's National Laboratory, where the most advanced forensic resources in the country are immediately available. Where time is not wasted. Where evidence is processed with priority. Nanos declined. Instead, he made a different decision. He sent what one federal source described as essentially the entire body of evidence at that point to a private laboratory in Florida. And that single decision created a chain reaction that investigators are still dealing with. Because according to that same federal source, once the FBI eventually gains access, they may have to start over. Retest everything. Rebuild the timeline from scratch. And in an investigation where every hour matters, that is not a delay. That is a reset. The source speaking to NewsNation did not soften their words. They did not hide behind technical language. They said it clearly. This is dumb. It is insane. And when experts in forensic genealogy heard what had happened, the reaction was immediate. A leading figure in the field publicly described the decision as devastating. Not controversial, not questionable, devastating. Because the FBI lab in Quantico does not just test evidence, connects it. It feeds directly into national databases. It accelerates identification. It shortens timelines. The Florida lab, by comparison, does not operate at that level. And more importantly, according to multiple experts, it uses methods that can consume the sample during testing. Meaning if the test fails or needs to be repeated, the evidence may no longer exist. That risk alone changes everything. A federal official told Reuters that outsourcing the analysis effectively cut the FBI out of the process during the most critical stage of the investigation. And the wording matters. It risks slowing a case that becomes more urgent with every passing minute. Day 13. And now we are at day 47. But that was only one decision. One piece of a much larger pattern that begins to emerge the closer you look. Because at the same time evidence was being redirected, something else was happening at the crime scene itself. The location where Nancy Guthrie was last known to be alive was not secured in the way a case like this demands. It was released before processing was complete, before every inch had been documented, before every possible trace had been preserved. And once that happens, it cannot be reversed. Media personnel approached the property. Images began to circulate. Details that should have remained controlled entered the public space. A criminal defense attorney reviewing the situation publicly described the scene as contaminated, not slightly compromised, contaminated. And that distinction matters because contamination at that level does not just weaken a case, can destroy it. Evidence becomes questionable. Chains of custody are challenged. Doubt is introduced before a trial even begins. And eventually, even Sheriff Nanos acknowledged part of this. In a press conference weeks later, he admitted that if given another chance, he would have handled the scene differently, preserved it longer, brought in federal support earlier. But by that point, those early hours were already gone. And in cases like this, early hours are everything. They are where trajectories are set. They are where mistakes echo forward. And then there is the detail that changes how you view everything that follows. Because while evidence was being mishandled and the scene was being compromised, a critical resource was not being used at all. The department's thermal imaging aircraft, the tool designed specifically for situations like this, the one capable of scanning terrain quickly and identifying heat signatures in areas that ground teams cannot reach, was not in the air when Nancy was reported missing. It was grounded, not because of weather, not because of mechanical failure, because the pilot had been reassigned, and not as part of a routine shift, as a disciplinary action, following a personal conflict with the sheriff. The pilot had been moved to patrol duties, and when the moment came when that aircraft should have been deployed immediately, it was not available. The delay was not minutes. It was 3 hours. 3 hours before takeoff. And a law enforcement source with direct knowledge made it clear what that means in a real search. 3 hours is not a delay. It is the difference between finding someone and losing them. 3 hours. That is the gap you cannot recover. That is the window where movement happens, where distance is created, where the difference between a contained search area and an expanding one begins to slip out of reach. And the people inside the department knew it. The Pima County Deputies Organization confirmed that this was not an isolated decision. They had raised concerns before. They had objected to key personnel being reassigned away from specialized roles. Experienced search and rescue deputies moved out. Positions left unfilled. Capabilities reduced quietly, long before this case ever made national headlines. So when Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the system that should have responded at full strength was already operating at a deficit. And that deficit showed immediately. But even then, even with those limitations, help was offered. Real help. Structured, organized, ready to deploy. In late February, a nonprofit search organization submitted a full operational plan to the sheriff's office. Not a suggestion, not a volunteer email. A 41-page document detailing exactly how they would assist. Dozens of trained search dogs. Advanced drone systems capable of covering terrain quickly and efficiently. Coordinated sweeps of the Catalina foothills, the exact area where Nancy was last seen. They asked for nothing except approval. Full cooperation. Full transparency. They were willing to operate entirely under the authority of the sheriff's department. No independent announcements. No media interference, just resources added to an active search. And the response was silence. Not a rejection, not a negotiation, nothing. The team remained in Tucson, ready to move, waiting for clearance that never came. Nearly a full week passed, and then eventually a statement was issued. The search, according to the sheriff's office, was best left to professionals. That was the explanation given to a professional search organization with a documented track record in complex missing person cases. And that decision did not go unnoticed internally. Sergeant Aaron Cross, the president of the deputies organization, responded publicly. His words were simple: more bodies are always better than less. Because in a search like this, coverage matters. Time matters. Resources matter. And turning away assistance does not preserve control. It reduces reach. But to understand why that decision was made, you have to look at the pattern behind it. Because this is where the focus shifts from individual choices to a consistent response to criticism. Sergeant Cross was not just any deputy. He was the elected representative of the officers within the department, the person responsible for speaking on their behalf. And he had been openly critical of leadership decisions. That criticism came with consequences. After a radio interview where he questioned department direction, an internal affairs investigation was launched against him. He responded by filing a lawsuit. The investigation was eventually dropped. But the conflict did not end there. Months later, just weeks before an election, Cross was placed on administrative leave. The stated reason was political activity while appearing to represent the department. Cross disputed that claim, stating he was in civilian clothing. Court documents later reflected that detail. He filed another lawsuit, this time alleging violations of his constitutional rights. And that case is still ongoing. Think about what that establishes. The individual tasked with representing deputies internally was removed from his position during a politically sensitive period, after publicly criticizing leadership. And when that pattern becomes visible, it changes how every other decision is interpreted. Because it introduces a question: are these isolated actions, or are they part of a broader approach to control? That question becomes harder to ignore when you look at the numbers. According to a retired SWAT commander, nearly the entire department expressed no confidence in the sheriff's leadership. Not a small majority, not a divided vote, an overwhelming result. And alongside that, another detail emerges. The most experienced homicide detective within the department has only a few years in that role. Not because of promotion cycles, because experienced personnel have left, gradually, consistently, over time. And when experience leaves, it takes institutional knowledge with it. It takes pattern recognition. It takes the ability to see what others might miss. So by the time this case began, the department was already operating without many of the people who would normally guide an investigation of this scale. And outside the department, that reality was beginning to surface as well. Public frustration started to build. Questions became louder. And eventually, those questions turned into action. A recall effort was initiated, organized, documented, supported by individuals across the community. Not driven by a single event, but by the accumulation of many. And at the center of that effort was a simple argument: that leadership decisions were no longer just internal issues. They were affecting outcomes, real outcomes, in real cases. And Nancy Guthrie's disappearance became the moment where all of those concerns converged. Because it was no longer theoretical. It was visible. It was measurable. It was unfolding in real time. And once that happens, once a pattern becomes visible during an active investigation, it changes everything. Because now every delay, every decision, every missed opportunity is no longer viewed in isolation. It is viewed as part of a sequence. And sequences tell a story that individual moments never can. And that is where everything shifts. Because up to this point, you can still argue interpretation. You can still frame decisions as mistakes, delays, miscalculations under pressure. But what comes next is not interpretation. It is documented. It is recorded. It exists in sworn testimony. And once you see it, the entire pattern stops looking like coincidence and starts looking like something else entirely. On December 11th, 2025, just weeks before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Sheriff Chris Nanos sat for a legal deposition. This was not a press conference, not a media interview. This was under oath in a formal proceeding with a court reporter present, every word recorded, every answer carrying legal weight. The deposition was connected to an ongoing lawsuit filed by Sergeant Aaron Cross, the same union president who had already been placed on administrative leave after criticizing department leadership. And during that deposition, Nanos was asked a direct question. Not vague, not complex, clear and specific. Had he ever received disciplinary action rising to the level of suspension during his law enforcement career? The answer he gave was simple: no. And that answer is where everything begins to break. Because public records show something very different. Multiple suspensions, documented disciplinary actions, internal affairs cases, days without pay, not one incident, not two, a pattern stretching across years, available to anyone willing to look. And yet, under oath, the answer remained the same: no. And when that contradiction became public, the reaction was immediate. Officials within the county did not describe it as a misunderstanding. They did not frame it as a technical error. They called it what it was: a serious issue that goes beyond a single case. Because when sworn testimony conflicts with documented history, it does not just affect perception. It affects credibility. And credibility is the foundation of every investigation. Every statement, every decision, every piece of evidence presented in court. And once that foundation is questioned, everything built on top of it becomes unstable. A county supervisor addressed it directly, stating that the implications could extend far beyond this investigation, that cases involving this individual across decades could now face scrutiny, not because of new evidence, but because of credibility itself. And that is not a small consequence. That is systemic. Because now the question is no longer limited to what happened in this case. It expands outward. How many decisions? How many testimonies? How many investigations relied on the same authority? And that question does not stay contained. It spreads. And while that was unfolding, another detail surfaced. One that does not involve past records or legal arguments, but present behavior, current priorities. The New York Post documented the sheriff's schedule during a 5-day period while the investigation remained active, while there was still no arrest, while a federal task force continued working the case, while the family of Nancy Guthrie was still waiting for answers. During that window, records showed limited time spent in the office, a handful of hours across multiple days, and during that same period, multiple visits to the gym, for separate occasions. And that detail on its own might seem small, but placed within everything else, within the delays, the decisions, the missed opportunities, it becomes part of the larger picture. Because perception is built through accumulation, through patterns, through consistency. And at this point, the pattern is already established. So the question becomes unavoidable. Does removing the sheriff change the outcome of this case? And that question was addressed directly by a former federal investigator. The answer was measured. The ongoing investigation would continue. The task force would remain active. The work would not stop. But that answer does not address what has already happened. Because continuity does not reverse time. It does not restore lost hours. It does not reconstruct a crime scene that was released too early. It does not recover evidence that may need to be retested. It does not place an aircraft back into the air during the first critical moments of a search. It does not deploy resources that were never approved. Those moments are fixed. They exist exactly as they happened, and they cannot be changed. And now, as the recall effort moves forward, as signatures are collected, as officials prepare to review records, all of those decisions are being looked at together. Not individually, not in isolation, as a sequence. Because sequences tell the truth that single moments can hide. And at the center of that sequence is Nancy Guthrie. Her routine, her last known movements, the final hours before everything stopped. She returned home. The door closed. She was inside. She was alive. And then, piece by piece, something changed. A camera disconnected. A sensor triggered. A device stopped communicating. Physical evidence left behind. And since that moment, 47 days have passed without resolution. No arrest. No confirmed proof of life. And when you place that reality next to everything else, the decisions, the delays, the pattern, it leads to a conclusion that is difficult to ignore. Because this was not just about what happened that night. It is also about everything that happened after. The response, the leadership, the choices made when time still existed. And those choices are now part of the case itself, not separate from it. And that is why this moment matters. Not just for accountability, not just for politics, but for outcome. Because somewhere within all of this, there is still an answer. And the longer it takes to reach it, the harder it becomes to find. If you know anything, a detail, a sound, a movement, a moment you have been holding on to, the FBI tip line is open right now. 1-800-CALL FBI, $1 million reward, anonymous. The task force is still active. The investigation is still moving. And somewhere out there, someone knows exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie that night. This is not over. We are not stepping back. We will be back.